So in this video, what I want to talk about are some of the themes for you to be looking at in chapters 4 through 6 of the reading. Now, chapter 4 is going to be focusing on the Reformation in Switzerland, and we meet two extremely important people in the history of Protestant theology, Zwingli and Calvin. Uh, Notice about Zwingli in particular his general approach to the scriptures, right, and to preaching, and think about some of the implications that has for the church today. I think Cornerstone owes a lot to Zwingli in terms of our commitment to book by book, exegetically preaching through the scriptures. Um, and Calvin has become extremely important. He's been important, for centuries, but there's been an interesting upsurge in interest in Calvin over the last 10 or 20 years. Um, you know, it's interesting to think if you kind of go through the list of who the most popular pastors are when people download podcasts. Uh, Overwhelmingly, they tend to be evangelical Calvinists of one sort or another. If you try to think, who are the most popular Arminian preachers in America, it's actually difficult to come up with a substantial list right now. So something has happened which has caused a real resurgence of interest in Calvin and the Reformed tradition. I think it's helpful, given that interest, to kind of go back to the roots and learn more about Calvin himself and Zwingli both. So one of the things about the Reformation in Switzerland that I'd like you to think about is this. How does the relationship between church and state function in the Swiss territories during this time period? And what did reformers like Zwingli and Calvin think that the proper relationship between church and state ought to be? Um, we normally think of the governance of the church, according to Reformed theology, as being situated in a plurality of elders. Now, in practice, to what extent was actually the city council in these different Swiss cities running the church and exercising ultimate authority over church matters? And how should we respond to that, right? Is that inconsistent with the basic principles that people like Zwingli and Calvin advocated? Or if we actually understand what their principles were, is it an expression of it? To what extent do we have to reject part of the understanding of the relationship between church and state that people like Zwingli and Calvin advocated? We can also think about some of their specific stances on particular issues. Certainly, two of the biggest issues during this period are infant baptism and communion, and how we think about the sacraments. And one of the things with Zwingli and Calvin to think about is how they navigate doctrinal disputes as they're trying to maintain unity in the church. And ask yourself the following question as you're doing the reading. What value is there in coming up with a vaguely worded statement that allows people who disagree about some things but agree about others to affirm the same document despite their same disagreements, right? Is that papering over disagreements? Is it disingenuous, or is it helpful as a way of finding common ground between people so that they can more profitably work together and cooperate? I also think the Catholic Church's response here is interesting. So in chapter 5, one of the topics is the Catholic reaction to the Protestant Reformation. It's instructive to think about this question. What are the issues where the Catholic Church felt like it could reform and it could change? And what were the issues on which the Catholic Church seemed to kind of draw a line in the sand and say, we will not compromise on these issues. In fact, we're going to pronounce heretics those who disagree with us on these issues. What were the issues where the Catholic Church did compromise? What were the issues where the Catholic Church didn't compromise? And think about what the underlying principles might be, to the extent you can, that might explain one or the other. I think it's also helpful here to think about both, in chapters 1 through 3, and now as you learn more about Catholicism and the Council of Trent and so forth in chapter 5, to think about what we can learn from Catholicism. I mentioned in an earlier lecture that there's a tendency toward overcorrection. So even as Protestants, even though as Protestants, there are clearly going to be a number of things doctrinally where we differ from Roman Catholics. It's worth thinking about what things they may have gotten right to ask ourselves, are there areas where we've overcorrected and we could profitably learn something where without compromising our got right, we could do a better job of incorporating into our practice. One of the Catholic concerns, for example, was that if you no longer have the Pope as the authoritative interpreter of the scriptures and Christian tradition, the reality is going to be just complete fragmentation, everybody believing whatever they want, doctrinal chaos, churches constantly dividing and, with each other over proper interpretation of the scriptures. Well, as you do the reading in chapters 4, 5, and 6, there's something true about that accusation, right? As you see all the different sects multiplying and some of the crazy things people start doing in the name of the Bible, you can see why there was caution. So here would be the question. How can we avoid some of the excesses to which Protestantism admittedly ran during this period, while still affirming the primacy of Scripture over church tradition? So something to think about. Now, one of the areas where things got the most off the rails is in some of the radical sects, some of them Anabaptist sects. Now, these groups varied a lot. And one of the things I like about the reading is it gives you a sense of the range. Some of these people, I think we can find a lot of sympathy with. Some of them clearly seem to have been either just immoral or had allowed power to go to their heads and weren't thinking straight. Clearly, some of the sexual immorality and other kinds of things that are going on in some parts of the movement caused the movement as a whole to get a lot of negative publicity throughout Europe. Now, what's interesting is a lot of the political radicals are trying to extract political principles from Luther, right, in terms of equality and challenging existing hierarchies. They just want to press this into the political realm in a way Luther himself didn't. I think, again, as you're doing the reading, think about the extent to which there was or was not an implicit political message, right? In other words, was there an inherent political message in Luther's theology and the various other variations of Protestantism that pop up? Or is it maybe a little bit different? Another angle you could think about as you're doing the reading is this. Not everyone who agreed with Luther agreed with him because they were fully persuaded by his theology and his eloquence and so forth. To some extent, he also is popular because there was just a lot of latent frustration with some of the existing institutions, and Luther gave voice to that opposition. Well, to the extent that that frustration, say, with the Catholic Church or with various other kinds of prevailing authorities, was something that Luther benefited from initially, perhaps we shouldn't be surprised at his inability to control some of those forces once that they were unleashed. I also think it's interesting to consider the Anabaptist tradition, right? Often people who are wanting to rebaptize because they reject infant baptism were heavily persecuted and heavily marginalized within the time period by both Protestants and Catholics. Cornerstone, as part of the Baptist tradition, has historical ties with precisely those groups that were being persecuted. So try to think a little bit about why infant baptism was such a big deal, what the implications were of people rejecting infant baptism, um, and what similarities you see that are present, and also what differences there are between, say, contemporary Baptists and Anabaptists from that earlier tradition. Um, Now, chapter 6, I think, is an interesting chapter in the following sense. You may get to the end of chapter 6 and feel like you learn more about the ins and outs of English politics and court intrigue and so forth than you learned about the church. Because in England, political maneuvering, frankly, is one of the major reasons why the Reformation comes to England. It has a lot to do with fights going on between the King of England and the Pope, and some of the different rivalries going on between France and Spain and so forth. And so it's a far less theologically driven Reformation than what you see in Luther's German area or in the Swiss region. So given that, one question you might think about is this. If you were talking to someone who had grown up in the Episcopal Church here in the United States, or maybe they grew up in the Church of England in England, and they started learning a history, and they learn about how the English Reformation took place, like what the motives of the king were in launching it, some of the less than savory things that happen along the way, and there's quite a few of them. And this person's faith is shaken because of what they learn about the history of their particular religious tradition. How would you counsel a person like that? What would you say to them? I think it's an interesting question. I think we can also, as you're reading, think about how people who are more theologically sympathetic to Luther and Calvin, but who are having to try to figure out how to work with kings and other important political figures who are less theologically in agreement with Protestantism, trying to figure out how pragmatic they can be. In other words, if you're someone who is very sympathetic to Luther and Calvin, you want to see genuine Reformation come to the English church, but you're, say, dealing with a king who wants Reformation for completely different reasons. Are you willing to ally yourself and work on behalf of